Call Me By Your Name is a novel written by Andrei Ackerman about the relationship between a 17-year-old Jewish-Italian-American called Elio and a 24-year-old Jewish-American graduate student called Oliver, mostly set at Elio's family home in northern Italy, where Oliver comes to stay. The book was first published in 2007 and was later adapted into a film in 2017, which was very well received. At the Academy Awards that year, the film was awarded Best Adapted Screenplay and nominated for Best Picture. This makes it one of only a handful of Best Picture nominees in the past decade which was adapted from a novel. Interestingly, a sizable majority of adaptations that make it to this list were adapted from non-fiction sources, autobiographies, biographies, history books, and so on. And I think that's a shame. I really like adaptations from novels or plays because they necessitate some interesting creative decisions. There are a million little choices that you may or may not make while reading a novel. What does this character's voice sound like? What clothes do they wear? What does their bedroom look like? But when making a film, actors and casting directors and producers and a whole team of talented creative people have to make those decisions for you. So a film adaptation is always interpretive, and you don't have to agree with its interpretation. As well as this, there are some creative decisions that only novels can make, and some creative decisions that only films can make. On one hand, this means that film adaptations can be very destructive to the original text, but on the other hand, they can provide exciting new opportunities to do something new with that text. I think Call Me By Your Name is a good example of both of these things, and that's what this video is about. There is one obvious, glaring difference between Call Me By Your Name the novel and Call Me By Your Name the film. The novel is in the first person, and the film isn't. Now, you could argue that films are necessarily third-person experiences. You're always this disembodied viewer hanging over the shoulders of the characters, and this is how a lot of films are made. In fact, some directors really lean into this and play up different aspects of it, like how Greta Gerwig detaches us from the timeline in Little Women, or how Stanley Kubrick makes us feel like a voyeur in A Clockwork Orange. That said, you can absolutely have other-person perspectives in films. They just work a little differently. Second-person perspectives are probably more common in films than in novels, actually, thanks to the trope in American cinema of characters breaking the fourth wall and speaking directly to the spectator. First-person perspectives are a little trickier. They tend not to entail actually viewing the world through the eyes of the character, like in Peep Show or something.
That wasn't very Christmassy.
Instead, first-person perspectives in films are usually communicated through a character's writing or speech. This can be diegetic, writing a journal entry or something, or more commonly non-diegetic in the form of a narration or a voiceover. Or somewhere in between, it's not always clear-cut. Now, the novel Call Me By Your Name is deeply first-person. There's actually surprisingly little dialogue in the book. The whole story is Elio's remembering of his past. He frequently goes on tangents about his own thoughts or related memories, or abstracts from the narrative altogether to tie the events of the plot into his own present state of mind.
So, with so much insight, would he not have noticed the meaning behind my abrupt shrinking away from his hand? Not noticed that I'd leaned into his grip? Not know as I sat on my bed that Sunday afternoon when no one was home except for the two of us and watched him enter my room and ask me why I wasn't with the others at the beach, that if I refused to answer and simply shrugged my shoulders under his gaze, it was simply so as not to show that I couldn't gather sufficient breath to speak, so that if I so much as let out a sound it might be to utter a desperate confession or a sob, one or the other.
Through all of this, we get to know Elio really intimately, from his deep feelings of shame to his strange, incoherent sexual fantasies to the private little jokes he tells himself. And all of this is sharply contrasted with what we see of Oliver, at least in the beginning of the book. For example, that quote I read out earlier from page 23 is Elio reflecting on his feelings about Oliver touching his shoulder during a game of tennis very early on in the story.
He put his free arm around me and then gently squeezed his thumb and forefingers into my shoulder in an imitation of a friendly hug massage. The whole thing was very chummy, but I was so spellbound that I wrenched myself free from his touch.
Elio finds his attraction to Oliver shameful and overwhelming, and perceives Oliver's actions as kind of cruel as a result. But then, much later in the book, after Elio and Oliver have become much closer, we hear Oliver describe the same experience.
After tennis once, I touched you, just as a way of showing I liked you. The way you reacted made me feel I'd almost molested you. I decided to keep my distance.
It turns out Elio's feelings for Oliver were always reciprocated, and Elio was just torturing himself over it. So a shift in Elio's perspective, and ours, is a driving part in the narrative as Elio opens up to Oliver and vice versa. Even though, remember, we only see this from Elio's point of view. Which raises the question, how would you communicate this in a film? Well, maybe you could have Elio narrate his experiences to us, and an earlier version of the script did do this, but Luca Guadagnino removed it, which is interesting. In fact, the film Call Me By Your Name makes hardly any effort at all to import the first-person perspective of the novel. We see the tennis event, or volleyball event, as a third party, with the perspectives of both characters left a mystery. We certainly follow Elio around the narrative more than we do Oliver, but aside from a few glimpses of his writing and a brief moment when he's writing Oliver a note, we never see him describe his own perspective. It's all very third person, which leaves a pretty big hole, practically speaking. Like, a lot of the actual text of the novel is Elio's narration and elaboration and weird adjacent thought processes. In the transition from a consistent first to third person, a lot of that material is necessarily lost. As a result, you'd expect to see long, extended periods of silence where we watch Elio think things as an outsider. Now, the costume design and acting and amazing soundtrack fill this gap really well, but it is worth pointing out that this shift from first to third person underpins a lot of the film's character. It makes swathes of the novel unadaptable, but it also provides a lot of space for the film to shine in its own way, and it does.
Wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete.
The women of the novel Call Me By Your Name have two main roles in the plot: to dote on and elevate Oliver, or to be collateral damage for Elio and Oliver's relationship. The best example of the former is Chiara, a half-Italian, half-American woman who lives locally and who is fascinated by Oliver right from the beginning of the story. Elio starts off as Chiara's friend, but becomes intensely jealous of her and their relationship. There's also Mafalda, who works at Elio's family's house in some unexplained way, who often praises Oliver and constantly serves him food. Elio says that she and the others treat Oliver like royalty. The Italian-speaking characters of the plot, Chiara and Mafalda included, sometimes have their English dialogue written in a phonetic spelling of English as pronounced with an Italian accent, rather than the American English that Elio and Oliver speak, which I think just pushes them a bit further into the background. And then there's poor Marzia. It's worth talking about Marzia at some length, I think. Marzia is a bold and likeable character who's clearly attracted to Elio as a friend, and more than a friend, but is kind of wary of him out of a sense that he might hurt her or let her down. In both the novel and the film, Marzia and Elio have a short-lived relationship, but it plays out quite differently in each. In the novel, Marzia appears in the plot almost unnoticed when Oliver asks her to feel the tension in Elio's back. Then Oliver and Chiara end up in a relationship of their own, and Elio doesn't take it very well.
I began thinking of nothing but what they might do together. I would have done anything to ruin every opportunity they had to be alone. I would have slandered one to the other, then used the reaction of one to report it back to the other.
Yikes. Eventually, Elio and Marzia end up having a romantic evening of drinking and swimming, but it's brushed over in about 300 words. This is a recurring theme, actually. Elio and Marzia's interactions take up way less space than Elio's thoughts about Oliver.
We were to meet on the same spot on the beach the following evening. I'd be there before her, I said. Just don't tell anyone, she said. I motioned that my mouth was zipped shut. We almost did it, I told my father and Oliver the next morning as we were having breakfast.
It's not a great look, though in the film she doesn't ask him to keep the secret. In part 2 of the book, after Elio and Oliver have admitted their feelings for each other at Monet's Burn, but before their relationship has really begun in earnest, Elio lies awake, waiting for Oliver to come back from a night out, planning to visit him in his room afterwards. While waiting, he plays out an imaginary conversation between him and Oliver in his head, and then we get this brief bit of narration.
It never crossed my mind that I too was a traitor. That somewhere on a beach near her home, a girl had waited for me tonight, as she waited every night now. And that I, like Oliver, hadn't given her a second thought.
So this is present Elio, the narrator, remembering how he didn't remember something, which is interesting in itself. But this nameless girl is Marzia. Elio is so engrossed in the idea of Oliver that he just completely forgets about her. Eventually, Marzia and Elio make up by meeting in town, and Marzia tries to get Elio to talk about how he's treated her, which he isn't very good at doing. He repeatedly connects how he has treated Marzia with how Oliver treats him, without any real self-criticism, and then, while having sex with her, decides to slip a note under Oliver's door asking to meet. This pattern repeats for a little while until eventually Elio and Oliver have sex for the first time at a pivotal scene right in the centre of the novel, and Elio's thoughts briefly turn to Marzia again.
I had crossed a terrible line. Not vis-a-vis those I held dearest, not even vis-a-vis Marzia, who now stood like a far-flung siren on a sinking reef, distant and irrelevant.
And that's kind of it. Elio and Marzia meet a couple times after that, but eventually she just fades away from the plot altogether. All this is quite different from the film. Marcia is in the very first shot, which establishes her more central role right from the beginning. The shoulder rubbing scene is still there, but we get to see more of Marcia's feelings with this little moment after Elio leaves. We get a few of these little bits of dramatic irony through the film in a way that we don't get in the novel, thanks to not being inside Elio's head. So Elio starts off in a relationship with Marcia, even though he's immediately distracted by Oliver. That said, Elio doesn't forget about Marcia altogether that night when he's waiting for Oliver to come back to the house. He forgets about meeting her while out with Oliver and his father, and then remembers last minute and rushes to their rendezvous point, by which time she's gone. Elio is better at handling this after the fact than in the novel, and seems quite concerned for Marcia's feelings. Elio's relationship with Oliver does still take precedence, but the film adds this entirely new scene where Marcia expresses sympathy for Elio and says that she wants to stay his friend. So the film repeatedly gives Marcia more agency and awareness, and this is a pattern we can see for other women in the story too. Elio's mother barely speaks in the book, other than to roll her eyes at Elio or Elio's father, or to half-mockingly praise Oliver's style and sensibilities. But in the film, she spends a lot of time with Elio, and they seem really close. There's this scene where she reads Elio a story about a knight, is it better to speak or to die? But in the book, Elio reads the story alone in his father's library. There are some exceptions to my rule here, like the Roman woman Elio and Oliver meet in part 3 of the novel. Another good example is Vimini, a terminally ill 10-year-old with whom Oliver has a deep friendship. Oliver and Vimini actually bring out the best in Elio.
Soon they became friends. She was always up in the morning after he returned from his morning jog or swim, and together they would walk over to our gate and clamber down the stairs ever so cautiously, and head to one of the huge rocks where they sat and talked until it was time for breakfast. Never had I seen a friendship so beautiful or more intense. I was never jealous of it, and no one, certainly not I, dared come between them or eavesdrop on them.
This isn't really relevant. I just wanted to talk about Vimini because I think it's really sad she isn't in the film. These examples aside, there is a clear trend here. The women of the story that the film version of Call Me By Your Name chooses to adapt have much more agency than in the original text. The film makes significant changes to the plot and introduces entirely new material to tie up uncomfortable loose ends that the novel chooses to leave open. Skin, 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 skin. What is it with this book and skin? One of the first things Elio notices about Oliver on the first page of the book is his skin, and that really sets the tone going forward. He imagines peeling off Oliver's skin, he talks lavishly about its beautiful colour. At one point he imagines physically climbing into Oliver's body and possessing him. And this is just the start of the strange, visceral imagery of this book, which not infrequently spills over into violence.
If I didn't kill him, then I'd cripple him for life, so that he'd be with us in a wheelchair and never go back to the States. Then it hit me that I could have killed myself instead, or hurt myself badly enough and let him know why I'd done it.
Wow, what a sweet love story. There are plenty of other dark motifs, like Elio repeatedly imagines Oliver drowning and cutting out his heart like Percy Shelley. And all of this makes more sense when you think about it as part of a broader theme, or the novel's worldview more generally. Elio is only really happy once or twice in the book, including the days immediately after he and Oliver have sex for the first time. But before long, things start going wrong, as Elio realises that the time he and Oliver have together is limited. And this is another central theme of the novel, decay and decline. In Rome, where Elio and Oliver spend their last night together, Elio sings this old Neapolitan song, which sums up the link between the book's morbid imagery and the transience of their romance really well.
It's about a young man who passes by his beloved's window only to be told by her sister that Nanella has died. From the mouth where flowers once blossomed only worms emerge. Farewell, window, for my Nena can no longer look out again. Tomorrow let's go to San Clemente, I said. Tomorrow is today, he replied.
But for every dark, morbid image the book uses this way, there's another of romanticised youth and vitality. These are almost always floral, like the ripe peaches that Oliver picks in Elio's family's orchard. But also, Andre Ackerman repeatedly draws attention to how young Elio is, much, much more than the film does. Elio talks about his high school report card, about a nightlight his dad bought him, which he still uses, and occasionally straight up says stuff like this.
The dream had been right. This was like coming home. Like asking, where have I been all my life? Which was another way of asking, where were you in my childhood, Oliver?
That quote is from a sex scene, by the way. I think these two equally uncomfortable depictions of youth and decay are two sides of the same coin. The first half of the book is about Elio and Oliver's relationship growing and ripening, and the second half of the book is about it falling victim to the passage of time. But this isn't just structural, it's thematic. The book vividly imagines the sexual and romantic attraction that Elio and Oliver feel for each other as part of the natural order of things. Growing, ripening, consuming, dying, decaying. And this natural order is where everything real is, where everything defaults to. Everything else is kind of phony. A lot of this isn't laid out in the film, which leads to some pretty jarring moments which make sense as part of a broader pattern in the novel, but are kind of shocking in isolation. Like the peach scene. People were so shocked by the peach scene when the film first came out that it kind of became a meme. But when you get to that part in the book, it doesn't feel that out of the ordinary. It's not even the most extraordinary thing that happens. I would say the same thing about this scene as well. I want to talk a bit about Elio's dad, actually. The first thing to point out is that in the novel, Elio's dad is a less sympathetic character. He's pretentious and dull, and everyone knows it. His relationship with Elio seems less established as well. Like this trip with Elio and his dad and Oliver when they go out to recover some sunken artifact doesn't even happen in the book. So in part 4 of the novel, when Elio's dad talks to him about his relationship with Oliver, it is surprising, but not in the same way as in the film, even though the scene is basically copied over verbatim. This scene is held up again and again as an example of a parent being caring to their gay or bisexual child on screen. At the time of the film's release, I saw a lot of people comparing it to this scene from Love, Simon. But these two scenes are very different in my opinion, because what Elio's dad actually says to him is a little weird.
We rip out so much of ourselves to be cured of things faster that we go bankrupt by the age of 30 and have less to offer each time we start with someone new. Our hearts and our bodies are given to us only once. And before you know it, your heart's worn out. And as for your body, there comes a point when no one looks at it, much less wants to come near it. Right now, there's sorrow, pain. Don't kill it. And with it, the joy you felt.
That's kind of dark, right? When you grow older, no one will find you attractive. Most people are emotionally bankrupt by the time they're 30. Some of it is nicer. Right now there's sorrow and pain, don't kill it, and with it the joy you felt. But that quote's not from the book. In the book he says, "I don't envy the pain, but I envy you the pain." All of this is a bit out of the blue in the film, but in the novel it reflects a worldview which has already been set up. Love in Call Me By Your Name isn't exemplified by the gay couple that Elio finds so embarrassing, or for that matter Elio's parents. It's not about dedication or commitment or any kind of eternity. It's organic and painful and fleeting. You should enjoy it while it lasts, because tomorrow is today, and soon the fruit will start to rot. There is one more big change between the novel and the film I haven't spoken about yet, and that's the ending. So after Elio and Oliver settle into their relationship a bit, Oliver and Elio's parents suggest that they go to Rome in the book, or Bergamo in the film, before Oliver leaves to go back to the United States. So begins part 3 of the novel, San Clemente Syndrome, which is easily my favourite part of the story. It's warm and lively and full of details that you just can't fit into a film. It's Elio and Oliver at their most happy and fulfilled. But eventually it comes to an end with that old Neapolitan song. Elio goes back to his family's home, and Oliver goes back to America. Which is tragic, and a pretty effective end to the story. In fact, this is exactly where the film ends, with a phone call from Oliver to Elio and his family to let him know that he's getting married, and Elio's emotional response explored and acted really sensitively by Timothée Chalamet. But in the book, things go a bit differently. Oliver visits once or twice after he leaves for the first time, but it isn't the same. Oliver seems standoffish, almost like when he first arrived. And then time starts slipping forward. First a year and Elio hears about Oliver's wedding second-hand. Then another year. Vimini dies. Elio writes a letter to Oliver to let him know, but he misses it at first because he's travelling around Asia. Then more time passes by. Oliver has children now, and Elio's parents put him on the phone with Oliver just like in the film. Only Oliver seems not to remember Elio the way he hopes. Elio calls Oliver by his name, but he doesn't get it. Elio thinks to himself he had forgotten. And then yet more time goes by. 15 years after the 6 weeks they spent together, Elio seeks out Oliver in New England. Oliver doesn't recognise Elio at first, but when he does, what begins is a painful couple of conversations about their lives since each other. Oliver shows Elio a postcard of Monet's burn where they kiss for the first time, which he keeps on his wall. They go for a drink and share stories. Oliver refers to his life without Elio, presumably including his wife and 2 children, as a coma. And then yet more time passes. 20 years after the time they spent together, Oliver visits the house again. He even stays in the same room. They wander around and talk about the past and Elio's father, who's dead now. And then Oliver finally tells Elio, "I'm just like you. I remember everything." And Elio thinks about all the things he wants to say in response, but he doesn't say them. And then the book ends. This is tragedy by torture. It's drawn out and messy. It makes you feel sorry for them. The tragedy of the film is much less murky. In setting us up for this emotional cliffhanger, it's more generous in letting the spectator fill in the gaps themselves. I'm sure there's a technical term for this, but I don't know what it is, so I'm just going to call it vibes heavy. The long stretches without any dialogue I spoke about earlier give the film a lightness of touch, which is very different from the novel, but by no means unwelcome. And it's not just a lightness in the script, the whole viewing experience feels a step back somehow. Oliver's ambivalence when he first meets Elio is much briefer and depicted as more socially awkward than cruel. We catch glimpses of Elio's inner turmoil, but only glimpses, and never enough to define the story. Moments of extended fascination in the book, like the colour of Oliver's bathing suits, are given homage but never fully explored, or even connected back to Elio and his feelings at all. And this is all fine, it's great even, but it was a decision. The film could have been very different. I think the novel Call Me By Your Name is a brutal, tragic story with some pretty unsettling ideas at its core. And while I wouldn't call the film Call Me By Your Name brutal or unsettling, I would call it tragic. It actually had a much bigger emotional impact on me than the book did. It's true that a lot of the discomfort of the novel is resolved or erased, but the film isn't just a sanitized version of the text. I mean, it is a little bit sanitized, it's a gay romance written for a mainstream American audience in 2017. But the tragedy of the novel and the tragedy of the film are different, and they're trying to provide 2 different kinds of catharsis. The film is no less effective, it's just trying to affect you in a different way. It's a very sharp, clean film. It has one thing it's trying to make you feel, and it is very good at making you feel it. Heartbreak, packed full of nostalgia and romance and youth. It's much more universal than the book and much less troubling. It's content to rest and let itself be beautiful.
Probably on the